What most people misunderstand about empaths is this. They assume the issue is social skill. That somehow, if an empath has few or no friends, it must be because they don't know how to connect. But that's not just inaccurate, it's backwards. Empaths don't lack connection skills. In fact, they often operate at a level of emotional perception that most people never reach. They read tone, micro-expressions, inconsistencies between words, and feelings. They don't just hear what's said. They register what's meant, what's hidden, and what's avoided. And that level of awareness changes the entire social experience. Because once you see beneath the surface consistently, surface-level interaction starts to feel empty. Small talk isn't just boring to an empath, it's disorienting. It feels like participating in something artificial, like everyone agreed to stay on the surface while pretending depth isn't available. Conversations become predictable. Reactions feel rehearsed. Emotional exchanges lack sincerity. And over time, this creates a quiet but persistent sense of disconnect. So the empath faces a choice whether they consciously realize it or not. Do they keep engaging in interactions that feel shallow and misaligned just to maintain social volume, or do they step back and wait for something real? Most choose to step back. And that's where the misunderstanding begins. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal. It looks like isolation. But internally, it's not driven by fear. It's driven by discernment. Empaths are not looking for more conversations. They're looking for honest ones. They're not interested in being surrounded. They're interested in being understood. And once they realize how rare that is, their standards naturally rise. This is where the social circle starts to shrink. Not because people reject them, but because they quietly opt out of interactions that don't meet a certain level of authenticity. They stop forcing laughter. They stop pretending interest. They stop investing energy into dynamics that feel one-dimensional. And here's the part most people miss. This isn't a loss. It's a filtration process. The empath isn't becoming less social. They're becoming more precise, more intentional, more aligned with what actually fulfills them instead of what simply occupies their time. But there's a cost to that precision. Depth is rare. Genuine emotional presence is rare. People who are comfortable being seen clearly, and who can see others clearly in return, or not the majority. So when an empath raises their threshold for connection, the number of people who can meet them there drops significantly. And they know that. They understand, often without putting it into words, that choosing depth means accepting solitude more often than others do. But to them, that trade-off makes sense. Because being alone doesn't feel nearly as heavy as being surrounded by people who don't truly see you. So they become comfortable in that space. Not because they don't value relationships, but because they value real ones too much to settle for anything less. And when you understand that, everything changes. The narrative shifts from, why don't they have more friends, to a much more accurate question, how many people are actually capable of meeting them at the level they live on? Because when someone is wired for depth, surface-level connection doesn't just feel insufficient, it feels dishonest. And most people would rather have company than truth. An empath would rather have truth than company. The next piece of this becomes even more practical, and in many ways more misunderstood. When we say empaths absorb energy, it can sound abstract, almost mystical. But there's a very real psychological mechanism behind it. Empaths are highly attuned to emotional states, not just in a cognitive way, but in a physiological one. Their nervous system responds rapidly to the emotional cues of others. Tone shifts, tension in posture, subtle changes in breathing, these aren't just observed, they're felt. And when you're around someone who is anxious, frustrated, manipulative, or emotionally chaotic, your body begins to mirror that state whether you intend to or not. So over time, social interaction stops being neutral. It becomes costly. This is where the pattern starts to form. An empath spends time in a group, or even one-on-one, and walks away feeling drained. Not tired in the normal sense, but depleted, like something has been taken rather than exchanged. At first, they don't always understand why. They may assume it's just introversion or stress. But as the pattern repeats, the cause becomes clear. It's not the presence of people that drains them. It's the quality of emotional energy those people carry. And here's where it gets more precise. Most people regulate their internal state independently. An empath, on the other hand, often regulates in response to the environment. That means if they're surrounded by unresolved tension, they feel it. If they're around negativity, they process it. If someone is masking insecurity or anger, the empath picks up on the mismatch, and their system works to reconcile it. That's effort. Constant, invisible effort. Now imagine doing that across multiple relationships, across days, weeks, years. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where their internal system starts to push back. Not emotionally, but strategically. They begin to reduce exposure. They start declining invitations. They limit conversations. They become more selective about where they did go, who they see, and how long they stay. Not because they've lost interest in people, but because they've recognized a pattern of energetic imbalance. This is where outsiders often misread the situation. It looks like withdrawal, avoidance, or even disinterest. But in reality, it's a form of calibration. The empath is learning to protect their baseline. Because once you become aware that certain environments consistently disrupt your internal state, continuing to expose yourself to them isn't kindness. It's negligence. And empaths, especially after enough experience, stop neglecting themselves. They start asking different questions. Instead of, how do I maintain this relationship? It becomes, what does this interaction cost me? And is it worth it? That shift alone changes everything. And here's the critical point. Most people don't even measure relationships this way. They measure based on history, obligation, proximity. Empaths measure based on impact. How do I feel during this interaction? How do I feel after it? Is there mutual regulation? Or am I the one constantly stabilizing the dynamic? When the answer becomes consistently one-sided, the empath doesn't argue. They adjust. This is why their circle gets smaller, but more stable. Fewer people, less chaos. Fewer interactions, more clarity. They're not trying to maximize social contact. They're trying to optimize internal equilibrium. And once they experience what it feels like to be around someone who doesn't drain them, someone who is grounded, self-aware, emotionally consistent, the contrast becomes undeniable. It raises the standard permanently. At that point, tolerance for draining dynamics drops to near zero. So what looks like distance is actually refinement. What looks like isolation is actually control. The empath isn't retreating from people, they're eliminating unnecessary interference. Bacall says, when your internal state is constantly influenced by your environment, protecting that environment becomes a priority, not a preference. And the truth is simple. If being around someone consistently leaves you feeling worse than you did before, that's not connection. That's consumption. If you follow this pattern far enough, you start to see a third factor emerge, and this one is less about wiring and more about experience. Because it's not just that empaths feel deeply or pick up on energy. It's that, over time, they learn what happens when those traits are placed in the wrong environments. Empaths tend to operate with a high degree of tolerance. They give people the benefit of the doubt. They rationalize behavior. They look for context, for underlying pain, for reasons that explain why someone acted the way they did. And in isolation, that's not a weakness. That's advanced social intelligence. But in the real world, that ability often gets misused. Because when you consistently understand people more than they understand themselves, you also become easier to overlook. Your boundaries become flexible, your patience becomes expected, and your willingness to stay even when something feels off creates an imbalance that others, consciously or not, learn to rely on. So the empath gives more. They listen longer, they forgive faster. They carry emotional weight that was never assigned to them, but they pick it up anyway because they can. And for a while, it works. The relationship continues. The connection appears stable. But underneath that surface, there's a growing asymmetry. One person is investing energy, the other is consuming it. Now here's where it shifts, because eventually, repetition creates clarity. The empath starts to notice patterns, not isolated incidents, but consistent dynamics. They begin to see that certain people only show up when they need something. That apologies don't lead to change, that their understanding is not being reciprocated, it's being depended on. And this is a critical moment. Because at this point, the empath has enough data to make a different decision. The question is whether they will. Some don't, not immediately. They stay longer than they should, hoping that insight will lead to transformation. But over time, even that hope starts to erode. Not because they become cynical, but because they become accurate. They realize that understanding someone doesn't obligate you to tolerate them. And once that distinction becomes clear, behavior changes quickly. The empath stops over-explaining. They stop justifying other people's actions. They stop trying to manage outcomes that were never theirs to control. And most importantly, they stop giving at a level that isn't being matched. This is often where people around them become confused, because the empath, who was once always available, always patient, always accommodating, suddenly isn't. But what looks like a personality change is actually a boundary correction. They haven't become colder, they've become more precise. They're no longer responding automatically, they're responding selectively, and that shift alone disrupts every dynamic that was built on their previous overextension. Some relationships fall apart at this stage, not because the empath did something wrong, but because the relationship was never balanced to begin with. It was sustained by their willingness to carry more than their share. And once that willingness is removed, the structure collapses. This is why their circle often shrinks so dramatically. Because when you stop overgiving, you also stop being compatible with people who are benefiting from it. And there are more of those people than most realize. But here's the part that matters. This isn't loss in the traditio. Nalsense, it's exposure. It reveals which connections were mutual and which were conditional. And for the empath, that clarity is worth the reduction. Because once you have experienced what it feels like to be used, misunderstood, or emotionally depleted in a pattern, not a moment, but a pattern, you don't unlearn that lesson. You integrate it. You become harder to manipulate, harder to access without intention, and far more aware of where your energy is going and why. So when you see an empath with very few people around them, understand that you're not looking at someone who failed to build relationships. You're looking at someone who learned through repetition which relationships were never real to begin with. And the conclusion they arrive at is simple, but not easy. Empathy without boundaries isn't kindness. It's self-abandonment. If you take everything we've discussed, depth over surface, sensitivity to energy, and the lessons learned through being overextended, it all leads to a final shift in priority. And this is where the empath fundamentally separates from the majority of people. At some point, they stop asking, how do I maintain connection? And start asking, what kind of life actually feels right to live? That question changes the entire framework. Because most social behavior is driven by an unconscious need for validation.